People's Solidarity Committee was created by the African People's Socialist Party with the clear strategy to extend the African Revolution into the belly of the beast. And it was the first time ever that the colonized African working class or any colonial force around the world has put the colonizer under its leadership, which is the correct relationship that we must have if we are going to be part of an anti-imperialist struggle for this world, for the destruction of the U.S. capitalist system. And I, again, want to salute Chairman Omali Yeshitela for leading the African People's Solidarity Committee for 44 years. And everything that I understand and that I would say today or any time is because of the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the theory of African internationalism. I also want to salute Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela, under whose office and leadership we work in the African People's Solidarity Committee, and the other profound leaders, Yeshitela, Mila of the African National Women's Organization, Director Hile, leader of the Adjupop department of the party, and so many other incredible leaders of the party who are here today. And one of the first things that Chairman Omali Yeshitela explained to us at the founding conference of the African People's Solidarity Committee back in 1976 in St. Petersburg, Florida, is that capitalism was born of Europe's assault on Africa. That, as the chairman has said many times, Europeans, white people were poor, white people were oppressed under feudalism, and that Europe rescued itself by this assault on Africa that began 600 years ago, and that has never stopped to this day. And it was the kidnapping of African human beings, turning them into commodities, the first commodities of capitalism, that created so much wealth, that created the Wall Street and the stock markets of Amsterdam and London and Paris and the United States, and created wealth coming into Europe for the first time that transformed the lives of white serfs and peasants in Europe into workers, because now Europe needed factories to build ships and to produce the cotton into fabric and linen and all of that in order to, they needed workers now. They didn't need peasants anymore. And this is what created the white working class. And the chairman has told us from the very beginning that the problem, the contradiction is colonialism, not racism, that we had all learned, that the problem is racism, and that the chairman has fought for this for the last 50 years, that the contradiction is colonialism. And I wanted to say that the thing that the chairman has made us understand and has written extensively in his books is, as he says, first of all, that African people are not a race. African people are a nation of people forcibly dispersed around the world through the assault on Africa and the building of capitalism, and that all white people are the colonizer nation. Therefore, all white people sit on the pedestal of the oppression of African people, including the poorest, most degraded, impoverished white people among us. Yeah. And I was noting that there's a book written by W.E. Du Bois called Black Reconstruction in America, and he has a whole chapter on the white worker. And he notes a couple of things. One, he notes that there were leftists, there were white leftists who knew Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in Germany who struggled in 1848, which was nearly a revolution in Europe at that time, when the Communist Manifesto was created, that, by the way, says workers of the world unites, but never mentions the enslavement of African people or the genocide that was going on. And we have to say 1848, that was the height of what they call the trade in African human beings. It was also when they were stealing the land of the indigenous people in California. It was also when Britain was imposing opium onto the people of China and they were fighting. I mean, this is not mentioned in the Communist Manifesto. It's talking about the workers of the world unite. And some of these people came to the United States, and a lot of them came to St. Louis, by the way. And that's a whole other thing that we could talk about. But they knew Marx. They considered themselves communists. They had a communist office in downtown St. Louis, and they hated and attacked African people, and they participated in the theft of the land and the genocide of the indigenous people. These were the Marxists.
Yeah.
And he also notes, W.B. Du Bois also notes that at the time of the opening of the Civil War, that there were 5 million white people in the South who were poor. Nobody ever talks about that, and that's a big percentage from the population at that time, that there were 5 million white people who were poor. And when he quotes people who wrote about them saying they slept on the floor, they had no clothes, they had no food, they had nothing, they had absolutely nothing. But he notes that they never stood with African people ever. No matter how poor and degraded they were, they would prefer, and he can't, by the way, W.B. Du Bois can't analyze it, he's just making that point. Chairman Omali Yeshitela could analyze it. That is colonialism, where the colonized nation, and it's been noted by many an anti-colonial writer like Fanon, Aimé Césaire. Why do the poorest of the colonized not unite with the Algerian people or unite, they can never analyze it. The chairman could analyze it because it is colonialism inside the borders of the United States. And you cannot find any place in the history of this country where white workers ever stood in solidarity as a class. We aren't really, but as a conscious force in solidarity with the liberation of African people. And there's some writers that say, well, there was once a strike for the 8-hour day and some Africans were part of that, and that went on for 5 days. What? Because an African would be joining to try to get a job where you would have 14 hours a day to work. I mean, just the betrayal, and that it was, it's white workers who carried out the lynchings, who carried out the terror, who carried out the mutilation and the just open terrorism against African people in this country. White workers and white women were at the front of that. White women were at the front of that. If you look at any picture of a lynching, a terror against African people that white people voluntarily carried out in the interest of the colonial state, white women are in the front of it. White women knew that they could carry out or impose a death sentence on any African man by saying that he looked at her in any kind of way. That's all it took. That's what happened with Emmett Till. That's what happened in Tulsa. And that's what happened in the majority of the so-called lynchings. They were instigated by white women. And that white women too were trained. There's a book called They Were Her Property. White women owners of African people. And she talks about, the African woman who wrote that talks about the fact that little girls, little white girls, had the power of life and death over Africans, not just the owners of enslaved human beings, but if a white little girl this high saw an African walking down the street, she could have him jailed, and that, or her. And that is the power of the colonial state, of the colonial state. And that, you know, that we talk about the LGBTQ, that it's also, its opportunities, every level of oppression of the white society has stood to get our rights at the expense, on the backs of, on the necks of the African working class and African population in this country and around the world. And that what has been some of the main campaigns of LGBTQ, to become the police, to become the Marines, to carry out the state violence against the oppressed African people in this country and the oppressed and colonized peoples of the world. And to say that that is racism, that is racism, the ideas in the heads of white people, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. And we can go on about the crimes that white people, and the chairman makes the point that the state, the colonial state and the white population are one thing. They are one thing. That's why no white person in 100 years of this terror called lynchings ever was arrested, tried, or went to jail for that. Because that was the right, and the Dred Scott decision said it, and it's still in practice, and that it was the African Revolution of the 1960s that forced the U.S. state to not allow openly white citizens to carry out the violence against African people, that it would all be in the states. And that's when we see the deepening of the police department to carry out what white regular people do. But we know that what the Proud Boys and all these people, the Trumpites, that's what they're fighting for, to go back to what it used to be. And the role of white civilians in the genocide against the indigenous people, from what I have read, that 80% of the genocide is carried out by regular white people, not the U.S. cavalry, not the U.S. government, regular white people, settler colonizers. It is not racism. And so one of the things that I want to say, and there's so much more that we certainly could say, because if we looked at all of the crimes of colonialism and imperialism that could not happen without the participation and the unity of white workers and the majority of the white population against African people and indigenous people, if we just look at the whole terror of ripping Africans out of Africa, putting them on what's called the Middle Passage, the door of no return, and working African people to death within 7 years, generally within the Americas, and what white workers have done and continue to do, we could fill volumes. And then if we look at everything that white people have done in Africa, King Leopold and Cecil Rhodes, and the genocide and the cutting off of hands and the rape in Kenya of breaking glass and shoving up the vaginas of African women, and all of just the terror. And we look at the depth of what white people carried out in this country against indigenous people, and the murder and the slaughter and the cutting off indigenous women's vaginas and turning them into hatbands, and just this violence that the world didn't even know what this was or what had happened. Then And then we're supposed to come to in this country and say that the problem is racism.
Mhm.
It is racism, the ideas in white people's heads, and it's saying that the solution doesn't fit the crime.
Yes.
It doesn't fit the
Yes.
crime. You're talking
Yes.
about the greatest crime
Yes.
against humanity ever in the history of the world.
Yes.
And it's supposed to be solved by white people taking a class to
Right.
unlearn
Right.
some ideas, not
Right.
accountable. And as the chairman says, calling on Africans to come, oh yeah, come forgive us. And I just wanted to say one thing. And imperialist jurisprudence, which is imperialist law, which is about upholding the stolen resources and the colonial state, says that when an offender breaks the law, justice requires that they suffer in return, and that the response to a crime is proportional to the offense. And that to begin to say what that crime is colonialism. It is the state. It is white people carrying out the violence of the state. That is what we have done. That is what we do now. And that is why the only solution is the liberation of African people, the African People's Socialist Party, the organized African working class that is building to govern, building to seize Africa and all its resources, and to use white people as a flank of the African revolution inside the belly of the beast to return the stolen resources in the form of reparations, which is in the form of the redistribution of the wealth of the world into the hands of the true producers. And that's why we say unity through reparations.